Good evening and welcome everybody, and thank you for joining us for this special vaccine webinar. Welcome also to our two special guests, Professor Saul Faust and Dr. Renata Walewska. The arrival on the scene of the vaccine from Pfizer has hopefully meant that things are going to change in the COVID world and the CLL world particularly. But there are still many unknowns about both COVID and the vaccine, and we're learning a lot about both. Let me introduce Dr. Walewska, who will say a few words, and then introduce Professor Faust. Dr. Walewska.
Thank you, Bran, and good evening to you all. I think this is a really exciting time since the pandemic has been announced. I think back in March, although we were all hoping for a quick vaccine, actually having that vaccine before the end of the year, it's truly astounding. Now, there are plenty of questions about vaccination and how safe it is, especially in immunosuppressed patient and CLL group, particularly. I think what it is important that pandemic is still there. Pandemic doesn't choose who it affects. It can be as lethal to very immunosuppressed patient as well as to young, very healthy patient. So it's truly indiscriminate to age. Of course, we know much more than what we used to back in March. But I think what is the most important prevention of COVID is not to get COVID in the first place. And vaccination will hopefully allow us to get there. So I don't want to spend much more time. I think we want to learn, all of us, much more from Professor Faust. So Professor Faust, over to you.
Thanks, Renata, and thanks for inviting me. So for those of you who, many of you are probably quite experts on the immune system if you've looked up your condition, and you'll all recognize the coronavirus from the news as a virus that expresses this spike protein on its surface. And it gets into the body and it causes an immune response if you've got an immune system. And the human immune response will deliver antibody to mop up, attack the virus and let it be mopped up by T and B cells. And as well as being involved in making the antibody, the T and B cells are, of course, involved in providing long-lived memory immunity to the body. So when we're thinking about a vaccine, we're looking for the vaccine to both produce antibody to directly protect individuals against the coronavirus, but also to stimulate in people who can make immunological memory, the longest lived memory possible for any one vaccine. And you'll know from our annual flu vaccine, for flu, the flu mutates, so we have to have a vaccine every year. For other conditions, vaccines can be given much more infrequently, and sometimes once or twice in life. So whenever we introduce a new vaccine, we need to know that it's safe, we need to know that it makes an immune response, and whether it actually protects against the infection, even if it does make that immune response. We need to know how long protection lasts. And for coronaviruses, we need to know whether there's any enhanced disease. And luckily, we've not seen any in the trials so far, but this is an important phenomenon for us to have been looking for in the clinical trials, because in the 1970s, respiratory syncytial viral vaccines, so RSV is a disease that affects babies and actually your community when you're having people with cancer when they're under intensive chemotherapy. And anti-RSV vaccines that were given to babies in the 1970s actually caused worse lung disease in babies who then came across respiratory syncytial virus than unimmunized babies. And this was a phenomenon seen 10, 20 years ago in the SARS epidemic, first SARS outbreak, in animals given the experimental coronavirus vaccines at the time. So it's been really important that we look for enhanced disease. And so far, thank goodness, there's been absolutely no sign of this phenomenon occurring in any of the vaccine classes currently under clinical trial, and certainly not in the Rna vaccines or the Oxford vaccine, and more about them later. So as well as the individual vaccines and how they work on their own, we need to know whether we're going to need boosters, how often we might need boosters, and actually whether some of these vaccines are better combined in sequence. And we call that heterologous prime boost. That's just a a fancy word for a fancy way of saying we're going to give one vaccine and then another rather than 2 doses of the same thing. So should we be giving a dose of the Pfizer vaccine followed by a dose of the Oxford vaccine, say? Well, we'll find those out because there'll be studies done next year and ongoing for some time as to which combinations will give us the best long-term, short and long-term immunity. So which are you'll have heard of the Vaccine Task Force, and in the UK with Brexit approaching, the government took a very strategic approach to securing vaccine supply for the UK. And the Vaccine Task Force is part of the Department of Business, not the Department of Health. And the Vaccine Task Force set out to secure different vaccines in different classes for the UK population. They call them sort of 4 buckets of vaccines, if you like, because at that stage in June and July, we had no idea which vaccines might work, what the global supply was going to be like, whether one company would be able to make enough vaccine to supply the UK or the world. So we've got 4 types of vaccine currently being talked about in the United Kingdom. We've got in the top right here, the recombinant spike protein-based vaccines. These are sort of classical vaccine technology, very established. It means sticking a bit of the spike protein to a protein or other molecule that can stimulate the immune system. And the Novovax trial, that's the trial of 15,000 people, is it is the largest vaccine trial ever completed in the United Kingdom. That finished recruitment a few weeks ago and in the UK. And so we'll find out in 3 or 4 months' time, hopefully, whether the Novovax vaccine will be good enough to be deployed in the population. You will have seen last week on the news that GSK Sanofi's vaccine, that's also a spike protein-based vaccine, has actually been just paused in their trial program at the moment. We were going to be opening the phase 3 very soon in the UK, but actually the vaccine wasn't giving strong enough immune responses in the elderly population, so the company's gone away to reformulate that or to change the doses to try and work out how better to do that and bring back the phase 3 later in 2021. The phase 3 is the later phase, the big trials that we do once we've established the dose that we want to use and a safe dose. We've then got the inactivated vaccines. So this is where coronavirus is grown in cell culture and then chemically inactivated. This is a French company that's actually manufacturing this vaccine in Scotland, which is why it's on the list. And that's beginning phase 1 trials in Bristol actually next week, believe it or not. And then over Christmas, the first bit of the trial, and then the phase 1 trial will complete in 4 centres, including Southampton and Newcastle and a couple of other places, Bristol and others in the new year. That's at a very early stage, phase 1 at the moment. The Oxford vaccine and the Janssen vaccines are replication incompetent vector vaccines. So these are cold viruses, adenovirus, human adenovirus for Janssen and chimpanzee adenovirus for Oxford. And these viruses have been engineered to put the spike protein, present it on the surface of the cold virus, and that is delivered into muscle in the immunization, and that stimulates an immune response. Now, there should be, the trials so far have included people with, some people with stable cancers, and HIV. There's no reason why, not vast numbers of people with those conditions, it has to be said, but these are non-replicating viruses, so these can't cause disease in immunocompetent people, in immunodeficient people, without, even though they're viral vectors. So there's no, in theory, these vaccines should be okay to use in people who have had or recently who have cancer or who've recently been treated for cancer. And then finally, the RNA vaccine. So this is new technology. It's not new, interestingly, to people researching cancer immunology, who've been looking at whether RNA vaccines can help in the fight against treatment and prevention of cancers. But in the past, sometimes the short-term side effects of these vaccines have been a problem. So the immediate reaction to a vaccine, the redness, the pain, when they've been delivered to muscle, has been a problem. But really interestingly, the companies producing RNA vaccines, who've been so quick at being able to produce coronavirus vaccines, so that's Pfizer and Moderna, have actually managed to find a way of delivering the vaccine, the piece of RNA, into muscle as a vaccine without those previous problems. So we can talk a bit about RNA vaccines specifically in a minute, but the idea is that this single piece of RNA is enclosed in a piece of fatty, what we call a lipid nanoparticle, so a fatty coating to stop it breaking down initially, and then that piece of RNA is used as message in the body to produce spike protein and then produce an immunological reaction. Now, people are wondering, this is new technology. How can we be sure that they're safe? Well, there's no reason to, now we've done so many people, over 70,000 doses of COVID RNA vaccines in clinical trials. There's no reason for us to be concerned that these vaccines are going to have any more or less side effects than any other vaccine against COVID. At any single moment, at any human cell, all of us have millions, billions of cells in our bodies, and each one of those cells has more than 5,000 different RNA messages at any one time, all of which are temporary. They're like, for older people like me and you guys, Post-it notes that get torn up by cells within minutes or hours. For our children, these are Snapchat messages that expire. So they're there, they get turned, the message is used by the cell, and then they're not there anymore. They don't and they cannot become permanent parts of our body. These are temporary messages that instruct cells just to make one viral protein, just temporarily, before it's just removed by the body. So for COVID RNA vaccines, that non-replicating RNA message is for one single coronavirus protein. It takes 25 different coronavirus proteins to make a coronavirus. So there's absolutely no way that the RNA the vaccine can either make a virus or incorporate itself into our DNA. Now, the Imperial vaccine that you'll have heard of is even more space-age technology. That actually is for RNA that self-replicates for a few weeks in the body. And the idea behind that technology is that too then disappears, but it is built in to replicate itself for a few weeks in order to increase the immunogenicity for any given dose. And the idea for the Imperial vaccine is it's even easier if it works eventually, and it's still in a phase 1 trial at the moment. But the idea is that you could make a lot more in the time allowed. So the regulators, the people who regulate medicines, that's the FDA in America, the European Medicines Association, Medicines Agency, and in the UK, the Medicines and Healthcare Regulatory Agency, or the MHRA, review all the primary data from these trials, and that's the immunogenicity and safety data before they provide approval for clinical use. Now, what that means is they don't take the company's word for it or the papers that have been written by people doing the trials or the companies. The MHRA in the UK has been receiving all the trial data from the major vaccine manufacturers as they have gone along, what they call a rolling review. And so they've already done a lot of the work that they would normally have to do before they approve a vaccine. Now, the MHRA are global leaders in regulatory, the way we regulate medicines for the safety of the public. You'll remember before Brexit that the European Medicines Agency was in London, and the MHRA led and developed most of the processes for the EMA. And so we can be completely confident in Britain that the MHRA have not left any stones unturned. These clinical trials of 20, 30, 40,000 people for the COVID vaccines are bigger than most normal phase 3 vaccine trials, way bigger than what would normally have been done. And yes, the process has been accelerated in terms of the manufacture of the vaccines, and the phase 1 and phase 2s happening almost in parallel with the phase 3. But absolutely no regulatory stone has been left unturned. Everything that is normally done to approve a new medicine or vaccine has been done by both the academic groups developing vaccines and by the companies that have either done the trials or partnered with the academic groups. As many of you will know from your treatment protocols, what has suffered is the other research in the world and the other disease research, whether it's cancer or heart disease or diabetes, everybody's been researching this and the treatments for COVID, which has meant that the regulatory side and development process can go much quicker. I'm telling you all this to reassure you that we think, we're pretty certain now that the RNA vaccines are as safe as any other vaccine. And any new vaccine or medicine can have a long-term side effect, but we're really not expecting them from the from the RNA vaccines. And in theory, they might actually be safer longer term than other types of vaccine technology. But you know, safe doesn't mean it doesn't hurt or you don't get a fever. These things are designed to mimic human RNA, and they're designed to stimulate an immune response. And so sometimes these sore muscles can be a positive sign that the immune system's working. So back to the task force, and this slide shows you the different number of doses that have been secured for the UK. And the model that the Vaccine Task Force has developed was basically to take the risk, the financial risk of the trials. That's how they've secured this for the UK. Other countries have just done a deal for the vaccines, and we've just done a deal for the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines. We didn't do these trials. This is how many doses this year and next year will be supplied to the UK and purchased by the UK. But for the Vaccine Task Force trials, for most of them, the UK government has provided the money to the companies in part for the clinical trials, and then that will be knocked off the bill if the vaccines trials are successful. And so, if you like, government have supported the studies by taking the financial risk in return for the contracts, which wasn't a bad concept in a global pandemic with Brexit approaching. But that, you know, can explain why this was a lone UK venture. And as you'll see, there's 100 million doses of Oxford Astrazeneca potentially, 60 million of Novovax, Janssen 30 million, Valneva 60, and eventually maybe GSK 60 million. Now, you'll also see here AstraZeneca monoclonal antibody. They're in the list because these trials, these phase 3 trials, the late stage trials, are very like vaccine trials. So monoclonal antibody is actually where you purify, you artificially make, don't purify anything, you artificially make in the lab the antibodies that the coronavirus would otherwise stimulate in the body, or that vaccines are stimulating to produce. And a number of companies are making monoclonal antibodies for treatment and prevention. Regeneron is being used in the recovery treatment trial, the recovery trial that you'll have heard about, that people who have COVID in hospital are being offered. And AstraZeneca have got 2 trials that are, one of which has started, one of which is starting in the new year, to use their monoclonal antibody, a bit like a vaccine, where you give this as what we call passive immunotherapy. And there's a trial in Preventer, so where people are being given this antibody, which is about a 1.5 ml injection into the buttock, a bit like a vaccine, but a bit more fluid, so 3 times as much fluid. And what we call post-exposure prophylaxis study, where you identify people who've been in contact with somebody who's recently been exposed to COVID, so family member or somebody living in a care home or a hall of residence, and you then immunize them. You give them the passive immunotherapy and study whether or not that protects them from COVID. And these are very long acting. They're thought to last for, the half-life is around 6 months. And this is old technology. We use a lot of monoclonal antibodies in immunology and in cancer therapy, but also now in immunotherapy to prevent infectious diseases. And the same company, AstraZeneca, have a similar monoclonal. We're currently in phase 3 trials in neonates, in small babies, to prevent respiratory syncytial virus. Those are, just, you know, the reduced recruiting for COVID, but we'll get back to them next year. So these studies can enroll people with immune problems and cancer, people with solid organ transplants, people on immunosuppressive therapy, and some chemotherapy agents are permitted. So in the UK, with these global trials, we're trying to enroll about 1,000 people in the Preventer study, and that's happening within the vaccine trial network all over many centres across the country at the moment. So how have we done these trials? Well, you know, for your interest, we've come together actually as a national network of the National Institute of Health Research, which is part of the NHS, And all 15 regions of the NIHR are involved in this, plus Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. So we've really taken a system-wide approach to this with our NHS colleagues. There's been no shortage of healthy adult volunteers. There's a national e-sign up. And we've really developed nationally a capacity for large-scale recruitment involving the coordination, training of staff, physical location and logistics. People have had to be on call for 24 hours because we have to bring people in if the outcome of these trials is symptomatic COVID. So people get symptoms, we have to bring them in and test them and do that very safely. And the Oxford study has done something very difficult, which the other studies haven't done. That is, everybody on the Oxford trial has taken a weekly swab that they've sent to the National Nightingale labs. So we've actually been actively monitoring subjects for whether they've had infection without symptoms, and whether the Oxford vaccine is able to stop transmission in the population, not just stop people getting symptomatic disease. So all of the study primary outcomes, or the main reason for doing the study, has been to stop primary COVID disease in individuals. Whereas the Oxford studies also looked at whether asymptomatic transmission is stopped, and the other trials are going to have to do that by an indirect method, looking at antibody responses in the groups, in the placebo groups. And of course, there's different antibodies whether you've had vaccine or genuine infection, but that gets a bit complicated to explain. So we've really done this in a system-wide approach, knowing that actually we're going to have to get back to normal at some point. So we're going to need to do this in the context of the NHS and in the context of research staff going back to what is restart normal business and all the other trials that we do in the NHS. So to do, in my region, we've done this with the new NHS integrated care systems and what used to be called the Sustainability Transformation Partnership. This is the organizational structures of the NHS in a region who've given us logistics and project management support. And also we've developed something, what we think is going to be really special as a model, which is, and some regions have done this, others have got a slightly different model, but what we've managed to do is open trials in different locations, just contracting through one hospital, Southampton, and everybody's trusting each other and sharing staff. And that's let us recruit in Bournemouth and in Southampton at the moment across our region, just as an example to you, because this has happened all over the country, where we've mass recruited to multiple vaccine trials. And what we're hoping is this will become a legacy for the future, which will let us do research much quicker and much more fleet of foot, because we won't have to do the contracts for all these different studies at 10 different NHS hospitals in our region. We'll be able to just do it once and then open the studies on the same basis, same contractual basis throughout the region. Now, why am I telling you this? Because it's a bit technical. It's because we might need your support as patient groups when it comes to it, if the companies want to go back to their old-fashioned model, because it's much easier for them to contract with one organization and manage it. Some of the companies, though, we've been working with have been absolutely superb, and it's been the middlemen, organizations, what we call contract research organizations, that support trial delivery, who've been more difficult to explain this to. But in the future, this could really help us in delivering clinical research and including cancer research across regions in the NHS. So we're hoping that even though it's been a difficult time for people on other clinical trials, we'll have a real legacy for all our research when we come out the other end, hopefully sometime next year. So back to the coronavirus vaccines. So as you'll know, Pfizer were the first press release. A bit of a strange time. Trials are normally reported in papers, but because of the conflict of interest and the markets and the financial markets, press releases have had to be made because to avoid breaking financial legal, the law regarding insider trading. And the world was absolutely stunned when on November the 9th, Pfizer announced that their vaccine in all ages was 95% effective in the primary outcome. And we were amazed for many different reasons, not just that the RNA vaccines were so effective against a respiratory virus, because, as flu vaccines are about 75, 85, 80% effective in normal, healthy people. So not just that it was so high, but actually this was the first time there was any indication that a vaccine would work against coronavirus, despite everybody been working on spike protein vaccines all through this whole year, this was the first time we got a sense that actually we might be on the right track, because as you well know, making vaccines against colds and respiratory viruses is really, really difficult, and has been historically very difficult. So we don't need to go into the details of this study, but over 43,000 participants, half of whom received the RNA vaccine, and the side effects were like any other vaccine. And Pfizer although their vaccines had, a lot of publicity, it has to be produced cold, stored cold, transported at -70 degrees. The reason why BioNTech, the German company that invented this, partnered with Pfizer, is not just because Pfizer are the biggest drug company in the world, but because they are the cold chain experts in logistics as well. They have been doing this for years with their other vaccine profiles. And actually in Hampshire, in Havant, they do there's a plant that does the global distribution of pneumococcal vaccine, and they've got a little museum attached to it on how they do cold chain delivery around the world. So that's where that's come from, and they know that they'll be able to deliver the vaccine. They're expecting to be able to produce 1.3 billion doses by the end of next year, which is a lot, but still short of if we've got 6 to 8 billion people in the world, whatever the number is at the moment. Remember, you need 2 doses of this vaccine to be able to generate an immune response. And we don't actually know how long these responses are going to last, because this headline figure is taken from 7 days after the second dose of the vaccine for the next 2-month period. And we would expect the antibody levels to wane over time. So we will see this go down. The 1-year efficacy will definitely be less than 95%. But we also don't know what the memory response will be. So we don't know at this stage. And people the trials will be going on, and the blood tests will still be being taken, and the people will still be monitored for coronavirus infection. But we don't know how often we're going to need to boost these vaccines, and whether or not, as I said before, whether actually boosters will be better with another dose of RNA vaccine or other types of vaccine. And you'll all know that the MHRA granted a temporary authorization under emergency regulations to supply the vaccine, for the vaccine to be delivered in the NHS under restrictions. This is not a license or what we call a marketing authorization, because the trials haven't finished, and the long-term, the final trial protocols don't end for at least a year or sometimes 2 years, depending on the study. But the emergency authorization is for use in a pandemic. Now, Moderna announced a week later they also make an RNA vaccine. They're an American company. Their trial also had over 30,000 people, was also around 94% effective. That was fantastic news again, because that suggested that the RNA vaccine result from Pfizer wasn't a fluke. 2 trials in reporting in 1 week made us think, well, this is probably real. Similar side effect profile in their small print, very, very similar to the Pfizer vaccine. Bit of pain, bit of fatigue, myalgia, nothing more than we would expect for any other type of vaccine. And then we've got the Oxford Astrazeneca vaccine that's currently, Moderna's under regulatory review at the moment. They are not yet partnered, as far as we know in the public domain anyway, with any massive pharma company. So they're having to work out their logistics and supply chain. So we're not expecting Moderna supply around the globe until April, May time, maybe end of March for some domains, but probably April for the UK. Which brings us to Oxford AstraZeneca. So the Oxford team, as you will know from the newspapers, also were able to take the coronavirus signature, the genetic code, early in January, when it was reported by the Chinese scientists who'd established what the gene sequence was. They were able to take that and incorporate it into vaccine technology that they've been working on for some time, based on the chimp adenovirus vector that I explained a little bit about earlier. And the Oxford team have previously worked on a MERS vaccine and malaria vaccines with the same technology, although the Oxford construct hasn't yet ever been in a licensed vaccine either. And we many of us in the UK were taking part in this study. We've had about 850 people in Southampton take part in this study, including all 240 of the over 70-year-olds in the phase 2 study took part in Southampton. And the headline figure for the Oxford vaccine is 70.4% effective. Now this, to our minds, was also an absolutely brilliant result. The press were a bit disappointed, which was disappointing in itself, but they didn't really understand that actually the WHO, or they didn't remember because the Pfizer and Moderna results had been so high, they didn't remember 2 or 3 key facts. The first was that the WHO had set 50% at being the rate that they would expect a coronavirus vaccine and a pandemic to meet in order to be deployed in a population. So it was well above that. But this result also had some interesting results that were reported. So you'll have heard that there's 2 different dose regimes, and the media have painted this as a mistake or an error. Actually, if you read the paper that was in the Lancet on December the 8th, this explained that it wasn't really an error at all. All the vaccines, including the RNA vaccines, are known sometimes if you get the dose too high, it suppresses the immune response, not boosts it. And so whenever you're designing a new vaccine, you have to take a bit of a guess based on your phase 1 work and phase 2 work as to what the best dose might be in a population. And in a pandemic, you're going to do that based on the safety, but also partly work that's been done before, but you don't really know what's going to happen. So we started off with vaccine that was made in Oxford and by an Italian company. And the MHRA were fully involved in the trial design, and the MHRA have to actually approve all trials, just like the ethics committee does, before you do them. When AstraZeneca came on board, and the decision after the phase 1 data had been seen was to expand the production in a very big way, and the trial to take in tens of thousands of people, both in the UK and in other countries, there was a realization that the way the virus particles were being counted, the vaccine particles being counted, was different in the Italian lab to how AstraZeneca were doing it. And a decision was made to go with the high dose for the bulk of the study. But we did explain to people who'd already received one of the lower doses that their boost would be a high dose, and that might actually be better for immunity long term than the high dose. That was explained to the participants at the point they received their booster dose and reconsented for the trial, because of course there'd been an amendment that meant that we had to explain it to people again and get a further consent form for them to carry on taking the study. So it wasn't a mistake, it was just a decision that was we'll do the most of the study with what we think will be the best dose, which was high dose, when it turns out, looking at the data, that the low dose, high dose was actually, more, by the looks of it, more effective or efficacious with a protection rate of 90%. But again, this is the headline, best immunity. And you'll also know that these are mostly the younger people, so less of the older people from the trial, and the group is much smaller. But it might be real, and the regulator, the MHRA, we haven't yet seen as investigators the antibody data that goes along with that. So if the neutralizing antibody data that the regulator are now looking at, because it's been done in the labs over the last few weeks, but not shared yet with us investigators, if the antibody data is higher in the low dose, high dose group than the high dose group, then the MHRA might think, well, there's biological plausibility, and if they think the vaccine's safe, they might provide the temporary authorization for the low dose, high dose group. Or they might say, actually, we can't see what, we've got more data for safety in the high dose group, so we're going to give a temporary authorization for that dose. At the moment, we just don't know. The other thing that gives us an indication that the low dose, high dose is probably the one to go with is the fact that the asymptomatic carriage was also less in the low dose, high dose than in the high dose group. So it looks real. So not just the primary efficacy, but also the asymptomatic carriage looked to be prevented more in the low dose, high dose group. So there's a couple of other things about the Moderna and the Oxford vaccines. They're much easier to transport and distribute. They're at 2 to 8 degrees. and large-scale manufacturing is ongoing. For the Oxford Astrazeneca study, AstraZeneca have also committed globally to making this cost price, so $2 to $3 per dose, and to make it available to the developing world, unlike the RNA vaccines, which are going to be very expensive, maybe $30 to $40 per dose on a global market. So we don't know what the MHRA are going to say about the Oxford vaccine, and we're expecting an announcement before or after Christmas, but the regulators have to do due diligence, and they will decide what is right for the UK population, and we can trust that that will be the right and safe decision when they make that call. So we do need to carry on our clinical trials. We have to continue enrolling because we need these different vaccines and technologies to ensure the global supply chain. It's unlikely that one vaccine is going to be enough, and some vaccines might work better if anything were to mutate. We just don't know at this stage. The principles for how we're going to do that have been agreed by the chief medical officers of the 4 UK nations, the MHRA, the Health Research Authority, and NIHR itself. And that's to ensure that nobody taking part in the study is adversely impacted whilst we try to ensure the integrity of the trials. And what that means is we encourage people to stay in the trials until the very point that they're offered a dose of deployed vaccine. And then people can unblind to find out what they should do next. And that's ultimately going to have to be done on a slightly different basis for each study to study, but is a national process now that seems to be working with people being called for the Oxford vaccine, people being called for the Pfizer vaccine who've been on the Oxford, Janssen and Novovax trials. Now, I'm not going to read this in detail. If you are a participant, or if you've got family and friends who are a participant in a vaccine trial, then all this information is on the Be Part of Research website, and you can see all the details for people who've been in trials. And it's not worth looking at my slides for this because it's updated on such a regular basis. I'm sure this won't be the current version. For children and pregnant women, we're going to have to start trials. Many of you might have families and family members in these categories. We're going to have to start trials in early 2021. We didn't start the children's studies early because of uncertainty over pediatric multisystem inflammatory disorder. But we haven't seen any inflammatory disease of any kind in any of the COVID vaccine trials. So we think these are safe to do, and we're expecting the Janssen, Pfizer and Moderna, Janssen, Oxford, Pfizer, and maybe Moderna trials to come to the UK for these groups in the early new year. Vaccines being deployed, as you know, and mass immunization, very unlikely due to vaccine supply for the under 50s. I mean, mass immunization is happening at the moment, right? But for the under 50s is probably not going to start much before May, June, or even a bit later because of the logistics and supply problems. But will be eased considerably and will be quicker if the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine is approved. So it's really important through all this work that your confidence, the public confidence in the regulatory processes is seen to be done. And hopefully I've given you some reassurance of that. You know, from a clinical perspective, most of the public, we think, are likely to accept pandemic vaccines to protect themselves and others because that's what people do every year for flu. And even, you know, the whole children's immunization program, every child under 11 and under now, and it'll be 12 and under next year, 13 and under the next year. It's been going for some time, adding an extra year each time. The whole of that program is to protect the vulnerable in society, not the children. And that's been hugely successful. So we think that people are going to see the program proceeding successfully and then be confident that they're doing the right thing, having a vaccine. And actually the Department of Health are pretty good at handling non-vaccine related events that can disturb this. You know, you might remember a few years ago, the new cervical cancer vaccine, a teenager collapsed on the first day of the program, but really good comms nationally, enough communication with the media to explain that it was a non-vaccine related event and that was investigated. And the same thing happened with the fight with the allergy last week in the papers, where that could, you know, if that had been handled badly, then the whole program could have been disrupted. But it's, you know, and the other side of that is that the swine flu trials, vaccines from 10 years ago, 2009-10, were a good example of why we need long-term follow-up for all of these vaccines. There were an excess 70 cases in the population of narcolepsy in European cohorts from the Pandemrix vaccine, which was the main one supplied to the UK, but interestingly not in the same vaccine that was manufactured in the States, in the Canadian population in America. So we think that was to do with a combination of flu genetics and the vaccine rather than the vaccine itself. But it's really important that we're seen to be keeping track of who's had the vaccine and the side effects, if there are any, as they come through. The mainstream media have done a pretty good job on this so far. So the media can help by not focusing on hesitancy, and we're unlikely to have compulsory vaccination. I won't dwell on this slide. Now, you will know that the JCVI, the Joint Committee of Vaccines and Immunisation, have ranked prioritisation for persons at risk. And this is in the public domain, starting with the old people over 80, residents in care homes, and going down, representing to 50 years old, representing about 99% of preventable mortality. All the frontline healthcare workers are involved in that, and anybody working in hospitals. And the clinical risk groups include, as you'll see here, this is all publicly available. You can Google Green Book Public Health England or Green Book COVID. It comes up, it's all in the public domain. Immunosuppression, including everybody with cancer, is on the list. And for lymphoid malignancy, we think that most people are going to be between 65 and 79 years. So most people are going to be in group 3, 75, group 4, 70 years and over, group 5, 65 years and over, with a few people in group 6 with the underlying health conditions, but everybody in the first stage. And we know that people with lymphoid cancer are significantly immunosuppressed and do have increased mortality from COVID-19 with what we call a hazard ratio of about 3. That was estimated, published in July in Nature. And there's 15,000 people in the UK diagnosed annually, and UK, sorry about that 10-year thing there, that's a typo. And the UK prevalence, probably about 124,000 people in the UK affected by lymphoid malignancies. We also know that people with lymphoid cancer are less likely to develop a robust vaccine immune response. And we know this from the flu vaccines, where there's a bit of some impaired responses depending on the therapies that have been used. And that we can do different things. We use different ways of using the flu vaccines to improve responses. And there's a question about whether that's the same for COVID-19. Now, this is going to need an observational study to evaluate the robustness and persistence of responses in people with lymphoid cancer after all the different vaccines that are going to be deployed in the population. And that hopefully will happen. The lymphoid cancer community have applied for that to be a study at the moment with the UK research funders, and hopefully that will be decided on very early in January and be able to start. For pregnant women, they're not advised to come forward for vaccine. You can look all this up in the Green Book. Breastfeeding is not allowed at the moment under the temporary regulations, and we're not immunising children, even children with cancer, because children don't seem to be at risk of COVID. 2 more slides. Firstly, don't fall for the myths in social media. These vaccines don't contain gelatin or pork. You can have vaccines if you've got mild allergy, but you need to, if you've got an EpiPen, then you might not be able to. And none of the vaccines use fetal tissue in vaccine manufacture, and they cannot alter your DNA. So in answer to the question, which vaccine should you have? Any deployed vaccine will have been fully evaluated by the MHRA. And for the normal healthy population, the main uncertainties are not about safety. They're about how long the immunity will last, how often vaccines should be given, how well they'll work in different groups, such as the immunosuppressed, people with cancer. And the message really is, please take the first vaccine offered to you. We don't know at the moment all the answers to your specific questions. Will the RNA vaccines work better? Will the viral vector vaccines work better? Should people have a protein adjuvant vaccine? We just don't know. But we do know that we will probably do no harm. To the best of our knowledge, we will do no harm by taking the first vaccine offered to us, because they will all stimulate immune responses if your body's able to make an immune response. And we know we need to keep track of the side effect profiles. And even if the immunity is not great in a particular population or lymphoid cancer, the chances are it will be safe and better, and there may be a chance that some immunity and good immunity will be provided. None of the people who've received COVID vaccines on the trials have been hospitalized or have died from COVID-19. And that's a really important message. Even if the vaccines don't stop us getting COVID, then they do look as if they're stopping severe COVID disease. And that is my last slide. Sorry if I went on 10 minutes longer than you thought. I wanted to make sure that I explained in lay language everything I was saying.
Thank you very much, Professor Faust. That was amazing tour de force on vaccination. So I think I'm certainly convinced that this is truly safe, although I've got to say before publication, I had some reservation from press releases, because especially when in publication, you could see that patients with immunosuppressed therapies were excluded from both trials. But I think, as Professor Faust was saying, I think priority is, if you offer the vaccine, have it. It's safe. Obviously, we'll be monitoring very closely, and there will be more trials, so we will know more.
And I think if you have side effects, then they should be reported. And there might be, the UK have a really good system, don't they, Renata, of what we call the yellow card reporting. That if you have a reaction that you don't expect, that isn't explained to you when you have the vaccine, then please tell your GP, and that they will be able to report it.
Yes, exactly. So that data will be teased out and collected. So this is a very important thing to do. There was a few questions. So obviously, quite a lot of CLL patients are on Bruton tyrosine kinase inhibitors, ibrutinib, acalabrutinib. Do you see? I mean, obviously, as you alluded, there are some flu data, and I think when I was I couldn't find the paper, but according to flu data, patients on ibrutinib response rates are between 7 and 26%. Is that about right?
We just don't know, and we need to find out. And I think the community of cancer researchers and oncologists and hematologists are very aware that this is a balance of nobody knows. But the option is to not immunize people with cancers, and that seems a mistake, because some people may well benefit quite considerably from the vaccines. It's just that we don't know yet. So that research needs to be done.
Yeah. So even that 26% is very important. It's better than nothing.
In a pandemic, it's very important. And it will also be very interesting to see what happens with the results of the monoclonal antibody trials, because it might be, if they're really brilliantly effective, that they're actually really good for people undergoing chemotherapy at the moment, or for people who've recently finished chemotherapy regimes who might not respond to vaccines as well. But those are still clinical trials ongoing at the moment, so they're not options for the NHS at this moment in time yet.
So patients currently on chemo, what would you advise? So obviously, if we've got time, I presume vaccinating 2 to 3 weeks prior starting chemo, that would make sense. But if they're already on infusion, so if they've on monoclonal antibodies, when would you offer them vaccination?
Yeah, I don't think I know I don't think I can answer that question tonight, Renata. I think people have to discuss that with their hematologist and with their cancer team. I think this is also new. There will be, as those conversations are had by the oncologists and hematologists and amongst your community, you will establish the guidelines, as you normally do when thinking about flu and other vaccines. And you are the people who will be aware of when people are most immunosuppressed and when actually is the best time.
Yeah, I mean, normally we obviously would suggest to, after the last infusion therapy, we would wait for a few months for immune reconstitution. So we do have those cells which will produce the antibody back again and functioning. But yes, but this is what I think if you currently on chemotherapy or any infusion therapy, so if you're on a combination venetoclax rituximab, you need to speak to your hematologist. Which vaccine do you think, out of all the vaccine you presented right at the beginning, which one do you think would be?
We're not going to get a choice. There's no choice. The NHS aren't going to get a choice. The hospitals will get delivery of one. The GPs will get delivery of whatever comes for them. it probably doesn't matter. There's going to be pros and cons of all of them. And of course, in 2 or 3 years' time, we might be able to look back and go, do you know what? Those groups of people should have this type of vaccine. These group of people should have others. But at the moment, the logistics of immunizing everybody in the country in sequence, it's impossible. And it's stated by JCVI and by Public Health England, just take the first vaccine that's offered to you, because you don't know when the next offer will come if you don't. And we don't have any data to base it on. We really genuinely don't at the moment.
I think one thing, because that was on the Q&As, one thing we know that none of the vaccine we've available in UK are live vaccine. I think that's
Correct.
what we can say for sure.
Correct, at this moment. And it's very, very few. I mean, Merck have got one in development, but as you say, these are non-replicating viral vectors, the Oxford vaccine, or Janssen if it comes online in due course. The RNA vaccines are a single message, not something that can cause an infection in your body.
On American Society of Hematology, they mentioned that the vaccine produced in India and in Turkey apparently are live. Do you know anything about this?
Some of the companies have got a live viral vaccine. So Merck have got one of their vaccines as a replicating adenoviral vector. But there are none in the UK task force list other than Merck, which hasn't yet come down into the phase 3 trial. So in the next 12 months, there's nothing to worry. There's nothing to be checking.
Yeah, and obviously herd immunity been mentioned, and was big uproar right at the beginning of pandemic before the first lockdown. But the herd immunity now, the whole concept is coming back. So with such a good efficacy, you know, even with 70–90% of COVID vaccine, what's the percentage of population needs to be vaccinated to kind of get to this concept of herd immunity?
Again, this is something we will only learn by deploying the vaccines. There is no data at the moment on whether the Pfizer vaccine and the Moderna vaccine stop transmission. As in, so if you've got no symptoms, can you still detect coronavirus? The Oxford vaccine, there is some data that's published now in the paper that one of the doses can or does appear to stop asymptomatic transmission. So until the whole population's immunized, we're all going to have to stay for quite some time, social distancing, wearing masks, looking out, making sure we don't put others at risk, because even if we receive vaccine, we might be transmitters in the population, and we just aren't going to know that, because the chances are we're not going to have symptoms. So that's a really important point. To actually get to herd immunity is going to take some time. That means we're going to need to know that the vaccines have worked, they've been uptake. You know, for children, we've got herd immunity from pneumococcus, meningitis vaccines of a particular class, but not from others. So the meningococcal C vaccine really brilliantly wiped out the bug from the population. We don't carry it around in our throats anymore. But for meningitis B, that's not the case. The vaccine provides personal protection. So we'll only find this out as we deploy into the population and test people with symptoms in the normal way.
So yeah, so basically the message is, although if you are vaccinated, if your family is vaccinated, does not excuse you not to carry on public health measures like, you know, the old-fashioned mask, social distancing, washing your hands.
At least for the next year. Maybe after that we'll be all right.
Yes. I was interested in the Oxford vaccine. There was a group which was investigated, which had only one shot of vaccine, because obviously logistics of delivering into millions of people two vaccines. People chose
one dose. Janssen have got. So it's interesting. When in an ideal world, in a pandemic, you'd be able to do this on one shot. The phase 1 studies and beginning of the phase 2 showed that almost certainly for the elderly, you're going to need 2 doses. And for the majority of young people, you might need 2 doses, especially for longer term immunity. That's absolutely going to be the case for people with cancer of different kinds at different stages. So Janssen have actually just finished in the US and globally a trial of 44,000 people who've only had 1 dose of their viral vector vaccine. And we're doing the 2-dose trial in the UK and America at the moment. And so people on the Oxford trial actually chose that 1 dose. They chose not to have a booster, and they're being offered they've been offered a booster. The JCVI advice for those people is to have 2 doses. So you just have to have, with the unblinding, you receive a second dose of coronavirus vaccine. So the Public Health England and the JCVI have decided that it doesn't really matter if people get combinations vaccines, that because they're against spike protein, that it's people should just have 2 doses of whichever vaccine. It won't affect your community, I suspect, because people haven't been in trials.
So that allergic reaction, it depends, sort of obviously Pfizer, this anaphylactic reaction, not. So is there anything you could elaborate? I mean, are we same thing for Oxford vaccine, or do you think that's
no, it'll be totally different for the Oxford vaccine. These are different classes. It's nothing to do with coronavirus vaccine. It's just that particular product. They seem, and it might be, and I think this is an ever-changing world, it might be that actually they investigate that further, and then the NHS decides it is okay to proceed with immunising people with more severe allergies. But at the moment, as of today, the NHS advice, as we know, is if you've got an EpiPen, if you've got severe allergy, then not to have the Pfizer vaccine. There's a question I can see in the Q&A about, would being allergic to penicillin prevent you having the vaccine? The answer to that is, my mum phoned me up with the same thing yesterday, my 75-year-old mum, and she's got an appointment now for her GP on Sunday, and the answer is that if you've just got a mild vaccine that you don't carry, a mild allergy that you don't carry an EpiPen, then that's okay to proceed, but just make sure you had that conversation with your GP or whoever else is providing you the vaccine. But they shouldn't stop you having the vaccine.
Yeah, that's very useful. With the patients who were positive and who had received vaccination, do you think the severity of COVID was less? Because obviously originally when we were talking about vaccination, it's not just preventing the treatment, but maybe making COVID less severe.
Yeah, but so let's just to take everybody back to flu. There's a lot of anxiety about this for no reason. For flu, we immunize every year. Most adults have had flu when they were younger, but then we get a bit older, we go off to be healthcare workers. We take a flu vaccine every year, or it's no problem having a flu vaccine every year, even if you've had flu before. All of the trials have not done a COVID antibody test to decide whether people get in or out. So for all the big phase 3 trials, there's about 5 to 10% of people who've had COVID, and we know that because they're antibody positive, but they were allowed to carry on in the trial. So the public health message is it's safe to have a vaccine whether you've had COVID before or not COVID before. You have your vaccine just like we do for flu, and then that will hopefully provide longer term immunity. Same number of doses.
Obviously been in the news that apparently in London there is a new version of COVID-19. Now, are we prepared with the vaccination that, like flu vaccine, there is always constant seasonal mathematical prediction for the best, to coverage for, it's a kind of predicting which trousers will be on vogue next.
Yeah, maybe Renata, but we're not there yet. Remember, I think the media over the last 48 hours and the anxiety is because of the strength of British science. So it's inconceivable that it's only in Britain that a mutation has happened, right? And that we've detected this. If you think this is a global pandemic, it'll have happened in the States, in Brazil, in India, in China, wherever they're doing the trials of the vaccines. And nobody's reporting that the vaccines are not working in their trials that are being monitored. In the UK, the pandemic research, at the cost of all the other research, as I mentioned in my talk, has been absolutely amazing. And we have a number of trials and treatments, but also in the science. And we've got a study called COG UK, which is taking all the positive coronaviruses and doing detailed molecular testing on them. I think probably we're going to find out when we look back in a few months' time in a way that's not being done globally anywhere else. So I think what we're seeing is small mutations that are being reported. And we're seeing this variation in the UK virus, but it's almost certainly happening everywhere else in the world. And we're just picking it up here and reporting it because the science is so good that it's taking that level of detail, the microscope, down so low. So until actually we see vaccine failure, I think we have to assume these are going to be small mutations in the coronavirus that won't spike protein, that are not going to stop most of the antibodies working. But it's another good reason for trials in different technologies. And we can be hopeful that the RNA vaccines are so much easier than flu vaccines to make. If there's a major mutation, then next year we'll get a different coronavirus vaccine, because the companies will hopefully, fingers crossed, the regulatory agencies globally will allow the companies to change the formulation year on year without having to do new trials in the same way they do for flu. We're not there yet, either in the what are the mutations about, what do they mean, or whether the regulatory authorities will allow the companies to do what I've just said. We'll have to wait for that.
Yeah, and just to kind of slowly draw into the close, how we can find out where the PROTECT study is open? Because sounds like that would be a perfect solution for the patients on a...
Yeah, they're all on the NIHR website. I think, if you go to the B part of the research website, you can see that if you are in near a major center, if you look up your NIHR COVID vaccine hub, you should be able to find it, but it is only going to be near people living near, I think, one of 10 or 12 hospitals for that study. And it might be something people want to do, but remember, if you do that, you won't be able to then take the vaccine. So because it's a monoclonal antibody, and so it's placebo controlled. So people may choose to do that, and it's great if people do, but if you actually want to take a vaccine, I think it's quite hard for people in the very top risk groups for us to bring people into vaccine trials now. For the trials, we're thinking the under 50s, maybe under 55s. But if your community are wanting to take part in those studies, I'm sure they can. Yeah,
thank you.
Professor, I'm sorry to interrupt. Professor Faust, could you send us the link for that particular slide? Because I think many of our members would like to have a look at that.
Yeah, I can. In fact, I can do better than that. For that particular trial, I can find out from the chief investigator exactly where people should look.
Thank you very much. That would be very helpful. Before we finally wind up, I thank everyone for contributing. Can I just ask one very simple question that's come in, which I'm sure is at the forefront of for many people's mind. Before having the vaccine, should I ask my consultant?
I think the people that Renata mentioned earlier would be a good idea to chat with their consultants. So the people undergoing chemotherapy, which the hematologists think there's no point in having a vaccine at this moment in time. So for most people, it's going to go and get the vaccine. Even if it doesn't work, it'll be safe. But there is a question for people who are the most at risk, I suppose. And I can't answer this question. I genuinely can't. I think this has to be a decision from the hematology community and the oncology hematology community as to whether the people who are under the most maximum chemotherapy at this moment should wait or not. And I can't answer that, Brian, I'm afraid.
Right. Thank you very much indeed. Well, we're actually over our allocated time. So let me thank both our contributors today, Professor Faust, for a wonderful and engaging conversation, and Dr. Renata Walewska. I know that you're extremely busy at the moment, and we are very, very grateful for devoting so much time for this webinar and at such short notice.
And it's a pleasure. And I must say, I'm sorry if I went on a bit long. I hadn't yet done a talk to non-healthcare professionals, so I realized it was taking a bit longer, so I should have cut out some of it. I apologize.
Oh no, don't worry, our community is very well informed, so I think and that obviously will be recorded. They can play it back, and they will be very good. And I understand you have recorded also a program for Channel 4, so there is something we will be able to watch in the near future.
There's bits and pieces in the media. I am just going to answer, so just to reiterate, because there are a few questions still there that are saying about this. These are not live vaccines, okay? You don't have to worry about these being live. They're all different technologies, but none of them can cause infections.
Thank you very much for that, because that's been a constant piece of conversation that's been going on with everybody. In fact, even some of the reporting on the news media has said that they are live, definitely
and the RNA
live.
Vaccines are single messages that will disappear. They are as I said before, the anxiety was actually from your world and previous cancer vaccines, but they were the immediate side effects, and they've not played out. They're not the new way that these vaccines have been made is working, and it's safe to use.
And I think what is important that that mRNA doesn't really get to the nucleus, to the DNA.
It
stays within the cell. Yeah, it stays outside. So how can it integrate? So no, we were not going to be becoming a GMP humans. Rest assured.
It's absolutely impossible, because it just disappears like every other RNA message in our cells. It comes and it goes.
Is the RNA vaccine an exciting development? And do you think that future vaccines will be RNA vaccines?
Almost certainly this is going to be the technology of the future if the immune responses are sustained and they're able to be maintained over time. So we don't know that yet at all. And I hope that we'll be sitting here in 3 or 4 years' time, actually with technology that can address many new infectious diseases much quicker, because they're so much faster to produce. So yeah, really exciting.
We'll invite you back before 4 years have elapsed.
I think your community consultants will all be experts in this by then. You won't need me.
Oh no, we will need you. We need you, but we will be curing RSV hopefully by then.
Absolutely, absolutely. Right, I think we better wind up there and let everyone carry on with their consultations and so on. Again, thank you both very much indeed for your time, and thank you everyone who's logged on. We've had a record number of attendees this time. I think this is the 5th webinar we've had, and by far the most attendees, and I think also the most questions. So thank you very much indeed.
Okay.
Thank you, Brian.